So she's going to be, Mrs. Yaffe will bring the copies in a moment. Somebody says that if I do a further picture, it's better. I think they're right. Okay, here we are. So we've been doing Chumash for a while, right? For how long?
2 months.
Right, it's been a while. We did Amalek. First we did a Maimer. I'll never forget that first week. I was so sick. I talked. I could probably trace when we started to that. First we did a Maimer. Then we did the Chumash inside. And we compared the Chumash in Pashas B'Shalach, which was last week, to Pashas Kiteitzeh. And then we did a number of sichas on Amalek. We didn't only do sichas on B'Shalach. We did a number of sichas on Kiteitzeh as well, on Amalek. And Amalek's a bad guy. Amalek's a bad guy. What's strange about the bad guy Amalek is you're supposed to remember him to erase. It's an odd concept that, of course, deserves attention. But there's a preciseness, there's a diuk, there's an exactness in this idea that Amalek has to be remembered in order to be forgotten. Amalek has to be erased. And of course, we have also the Mochi Emcha and the Mochi Timcha and the Mochi Emcha. Yidden have a mitzvah to erase Amalek, and Hashem promises that he will erase Amalek. What's so bad about Amalek? Why is Amalek such a bad guy? So we touched on it a little bit. I can't say we did it thoroughly, but we touched on it. Today is going Amalek v'achris ad Yevin. Amalek is chutzpah b'litaga. Amalek hates Hashem, hates Torah, hates Yidden. So on the one hand, we say Yedei Asri Boinai. He knows what it's about. He's a smart guy. He's got to figure it out. He's a rebel on purpose. Right? And on the other hand, his issue with Yiddishkeit is not based on logic. He doesn't come along and say, this is my problem. He says, I hate you because you exist. And the Torah says, the Amalek has to be erased. And because we were doing Chumash, we suspended Siddur. The beginning of this year, we did the last third of Haidu. It was actually pretty concise. We covered more ground than I thought and less time than I expected. We did from, from Behurachim till the end of Haidu. And I told you then that when we finish Amalek, we're going to go back and do Siddur, we're going to do Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. I don't know how many weeks to take. It'll certainly take 3 Wednesdays, possibly 4, maybe 5. But we're going to learn Mizmor Shir Chanukas. It's the next piece of Siddur. Okay, it's the next piece of Siddur. And then we finish Mizmor Shir Chanukas, we'll do the beginning of Yisrei. We'll do Vayishma Yisrei. Well, I haven't yet decided how I will do that because there's a whole question when Yisrei came and when Yisrei left and when the whole story happened and so on. But okay, we'll leave that to Mitzvah Hashem for a rainy day. But we're learning Siddur. So let's get to the Siddur, okay? The davening is very long. Our davening is very long. I thank you very much. Can everybody take one of these? If you look on the left side of the page, we have the English lines, you'll notice that I put numbers because I put numbers to parallel this. It says here that there's 11 psukim. Some places it says it is 15 psukim. I don't know how to resolve that, but 11 psukim. So you have on the left side, you have vertical lines that tell you each pasuk ends. One, and then you have. I did it in such a way that you're able to identify the psukim, the division of the psukim. Okay, thank you very much. The davening that we do every day is very long. It's very long, right? It starts on page whatever it is, 16 or 17, and it goes until page, I don't know what, 48. It's a long davening. The original davening was much, much, much shorter, right? And it evolved, it stretched, it elongated over time. Technically, davening is 19 berachot Shmones, 18 berachot Shmones. And the way I see it, and of course the way I see it is in no way a reflection of the fact, it's just the way I see it, the way I think the facts were. Once upon a time, if you go back far enough in our history, every Jew, every single day, did 4 separate things. 4 separate things. You get up in the morning, you said brachas. Right? You opened your eyes, you said Pekech Ivrim. You stood up, you said Mater Asurim. You put on your clothes, you said Mal B'Sharumim. You literally prayed as you took care of your morning needs. Then at some point, you would say the Psuke de Zimra. That means you would say songs of praise. According to the Rambam, you can do it a whole day. And the songs of praise had a bracha before Baruch She'amar, and a bracha after Yishtabach. At a different time of a day, but this had a clock. This had to be done before a quarter of the day passed. You would say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And with Shema Yisrael also was brachas, 2 brachas before, Yoitzer Eduvei Cheshach, and then Ava Selam, and then 1 bracha after, Emes V'Yatzav V'Nochem V'Gayim V'Yasher, until Gal Yisrael. That was a separate thing. And then you had a 4th idea, which was Shemini Esrei Amida. Hashem Safas Tiftach V'Yagit Yilasacha. Originally it was 18 brachas. In the times of the Shas, they added V'Lam Hashinim, it became 19 brachas. So if you can go back far enough into our past, you will find that these were 4 separated things. You're up in the morning, you said brachas. We still do that, yeah? Then, whenever you had a moment, you could do it even in the afternoon, according to the Rambam, you would say Tefilah David. Hashem provides panos of everybody. And before that, you had Baruch She'amar, and after that, you had Yishtabach. Before 3 hours in the day, in other words, if we were going to say that the day is from 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock, before 9 o'clock in the morning, you had to say Shema with a bracha before and a bracha after. And then, according to the same measure, before 10 o'clock, you had to say Shemini Esrei. And they were separate things. Amida was one thing, Kishma was another thing, Psukim was a 3rd thing, and the brachas were a 4th thing. At some point in our history, it was decided to join them together, right? The first joining together is called Smichas Geula L'Tefilah. Baruch Atah Hashem Gal Yisrael Hashem Sefasei Tiftach. That's right after you finish the blessings of Shema, which finish both in the morning and at night. With Gal Yisrael, you should read or say the Amida. This is a Zohar, okay? And Yigol Chatayv Yigol, but it's a joining together of 2 rituals, of 2 services, of 2 avodas. They were one separate. I don't know how long ago they were separate. I don't know at what point they were joined together, but they were separate things. They were glued together. That we say, don't just say Shemini Esrei, say also Birchas Kishma. Join them together. At a later date, someone said, "Wait, you're saying Psukim de Zimra, say them before Shema also." So you join Baruch She'amar till Yishtabach and the Psukim in between. You join Shema and Kishma B'Chlal and the bracha before and after together with Psukim de Zimra, and these 3 things became a continuum. Okay. Now, in addition to these 3 separated rituals being joined together, another thing was happening over time. They were getting bigger, like Pinocchio's nose. Right? How big was Psukim de Zimra in the beginning? It's theoretically possible to say Psukim de Zimra in the beginning was, you said Baruch She'amar, he said one pasuk. Then someone said, say the whole kapitel. So we started saying from Tehilah L'David, in the beginning of Ashrei till the end of Ashrei. And then we said, it's almost the end of Tillim, finished till the end of the Tillim. And then they added Yechavayit, and then Mizmor Shir Chanukas, and then Vayavarach David, Baruch Hashem La'elam, it became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So there were 2 separate historical processes. The earlier historical process is to take 3 separated things, and put them together in a chain. Shemini Esrei is not separate. It's set together with Krishma, the brachas before and after. Shemini Esrei and the brachas before and after Krishma with Krishma are not set separate. They're joined together with Psukim de Zimra. These are later takonas. They could have been even in the times of the Shas, but they were later takonas. That's why there were such interesting observations made in the Sfarim about talking. You're not allowed to talk about Psukim de Zimra. You're not allowed to talk about what about between Psukim de Zimra and Birchas Krishma? It's not the same. But once the Chachamim said, join them together, if you talk, don't ask what's going to happen to you. You understand? And then the same is true between Gal Yisrael and Shemini Esrei. Once it was established, Smichas Geula L'Tefilah, you don't even say Amen. If you hear the Chazan say Baruch Atah Hashem Gal Yisrael, you don't say Amen because it's considered an interruption. That's why in most communities of Jews, they say Gal Yisrael quietly. And in Chabad, the Chazan says Gal Yisrael loud, but you say it together with the Chazan. You say together because you're not supposed to answer Amen in your own bracha. So if you say together with the Chazan, Baruch Atah Hashem Gal Yisrael, there's no issue with an Amen, with an Amen. I believe, and what I'm about to say is wrong, but I'm going to say it anyway, that this process of taking these 3 separate things, the Shemini Esrei, Shema and its brachas, and then Psei Chidecha and its brachas, and join them together is called Kereach Es Shema. There's a Lashon in Gemara, which is brought in Shulchan Aruch, to wrap Shema. First, Shema was wrapped around Shemini Esrei, a blanket around Shemini Esrei, and then Psukei de Zimra was wrapped around Shema. We took three separate things and we made them like to a fruit, a patty, a fruit, a shell, and a second shell. We made them come together. And that's why our davening is so long, because we're not doing one thing. We're actually doing several different things, which over time we're joined together. And again, I want to remind you, there's two separate processes taking place. One process is joining three separate things together. The other process is they keep on growing. Each one of those becomes bigger and bigger over time. The Bechaz Kishma became bigger. The Shemini Esrei became bigger, perhaps. And certainly the Psukei de Zimra became bigger over time. Now, if Shemini Esrei is here and Bechaz Kishma are wrapping Shemini Esrei, they have to wrap it on both sides, not just on one side. So after Shemini Esrei, they added something to correspond to the Bechaz Kishma before Shemini Esrei. If Shemini Esrei is here and around that you have Kishma and Psukei de Zimra is outside, it has to be wrapped on both sides. So they added a bunch of stuff after Shemini Esrei, so that it's actually concentrated. The beginning, the center of the davening is Shemini Esrei. On this side is Psukei de Kishma, on this side is something else. On this side is Psukei de Zimra, there's something else. That's why we have after Shemini Esrei, we have Vidui, and we have Tachnon and Vidui, and Sapayim, Asher Voltzion, Shir Shayim, Hayom Yom Revi'i B'Shabbos, and Kaveh. These pieces of davening added after Shemini Esrei are seen the other half of the blanket. You understand? If you're wrapping it on this side, you have to wrap it on both sides. And this is why our Tefilah has become so extensive, so long. The problem is that for so many of us, we don't have the time, we don't have the concentration. It becomes very laborious and it's very difficult. But if we understood what we were doing, and we occasionally had the time, or we gave ourselves the time, made for ourselves the time, this long davening is not just this boring collection of words and pages. There's a whole journey, there's a whole story that's take place of going through this entire process. You understand? Yeah? And in more recent times, it's really a Zohar originally, but certainly some of this in Kabbalah, we have defined this journey as a ladder, sulam, a ladder. Right? Sulam mutzav arza, the ladder stands on the ground, which means the lowest level of earth. V'roishei magia hashamayma, the head of the ladder reaches up into the highest level of heaven. And the Zohar says, sulam dot loisa. The ladder is prayer. The ladder is prayer. There's rungs. Originally, they were separate. But when they were joined together, when they were glued together, Bechaz Kishma, with the brachas before and after, to Shemini Kishma and its brachas, and then Shemini Esrei, and then later on they added a backside to each one of these. They call it a ladder. It's steps. And of course, the way the ladder works, you're coming from a lower level to a higher level to reach the very, very top, and then you come back down. But coming back down is not supposed to be construed as going away. Coming back down is supposed to be construed as taking along. If I state, you understand? You go up a ladder, you get closer and closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then you bring that closeness to the Eibishter, the pinnacle of which, the height of which, the highest point of which, B'Klalos, is Shemini Esrei, you bring that back with you. And of course, it says in the Gemara, and it's brought in Chassidus a lot, that once this body was created, this gluing together different parts of davening to make it into concentric rings or a ladder where you're climbing up and you're climbing down. So the Gemara says, you want to daven as soon as you get up in the morning. As soon as you can, you want to daven. As soon as you can, you want to start your day, because we start our day with Chassidus, because Chassidus is a hachana l'tefillah, the preparation for davening. But you want to daven in the morning. You want to climb the ladder. What happens when you finish davening? So it says in the Gemara again, after you daven, you learn Torah. And again, just like in davening, we took separated entities, separate things, and joined them together to create a bigger and bigger body. The same is true also if you look in Sifrei Kabbalah, the Arizal and other Mekubalim, the significance of learning Torah right after davening. Because we're gluing more and more things together to create a continuum of avodah, a continuum of involvement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You finish davening, you sit down and learn Torah. Learning Torah in many ways is higher than davening. So davening is the precursor. Davening is the first step. Davening is the first rungs of the ladder that bring you to a place that as soon as you finish davening, you tunnel in. And then it says, "Mi beis hamedrish hanig bohem minig derech eretz." After you get daven and you learn Torah, then you go for panasa, to make a living. And if you string this all together, just like in the davening itself, you're stringing together Shminesra, Bechas Krishma, and Krishma, Psukei Dezim, and Brachas, and so forth. And then you string all of that to Torah when you go to work. And it doesn't matter what you do. You're a plumber, you're an electrician, you're a balagola, you whatever you do, but you're working. The work is also Avodas Hashem. And the work is also part of these concentric rings. And the work is also part of this ladder. But they have to be coupled, have to be joined together. And that's the way Chassidus and Kabbalah explain the life of a person. Nothing that a human being does ever is outside of the parameters of Avodas Hashem. Everything is serving Hashem. Making money is serving Hashem, just like davening and learning is serving Hashem. Supporting your family is serving Hashem, just like davening and learning is serving Hashem. Giving tzedakah and helping other people is serving Hashem, just like davening and learning is serving Hashem. And what Kabbalah and Chassidus does, and it goes back to before Kabbalah still, is join, couple, right? Way back, 2,500 years ago. The Chachamim made a variety of takanas. And then over time, and it could have been very early on, they began to join these different takanas together. They strung them together. So you're not just doing a bunch of different things. You're doing a bunch of different things in a series of locked or interlocked rings, like rungs of a ladder that make the steps gradual. You're going from A to B to C to D to E to F to G to H and so on and so forth. And of course, at night, you get into bed, you say Amapel, and then you do Z. Like it says from the Baal Shem Tov, every day you have 42 journeys until you come to what's Eretz Yisrael, you go to sleep. Now, we're taking this journey and we're finishing the first rung. We're finishing the first rung. If we finish the first rung by the time this year is out, it will have been a successful year of Siddur. Why? Because there's another piece of davening that I have not yet mentioned. So far, I told you about three parts to davening, right? The center of davening is Shemini Esrei. Around the Shemini Esrei is the Bechas Krishma and the Krishma. Around the Bechas Krishma and Krishma, the Psukei Dezimra. The brachas before and after, and the Psukei Zimra, the songs of praise. You do open up, or you should open up your hand, your yud, and you give sufficient, you give satisfaction to every living thing. Ratzon. What does Ratzon mean? Your will or their will, or both wills. That's the essence of Psukei Zimra, is this pasuk that Hashem takes care of us. Hashem provides for us. And before that, you say Baruch She'amar V'Ha'elam, and after you say Yishtab Hashem Chalad Malkeinu. These are brachas. But there's a fourth rung to the ladder. And this was added later. How much later, I don't know, probably a lot later. And the fourth rung to the ladder is what we call Haida'ah, submission, acceptance. Meidani lefanecha. Haidal Hashem kirei v'shmoi. And whenever this fourth rung was added, the davening now has another dimension. It's not three things where the center is Shemini Esrei, and around it is Bechas Krishma and Krishma, and around it is Psukei Zimra and its brachas, but around that there's something called Haidah. Haidah means acceptance, submission, just acceptance. And as you know, this corresponds to the four worlds: Asiya, Yetzira, Bria, and Atzilas. So at one point, it was decided by some great rabbi or a series of great rabbis. It was after the Zman HaShas, Bepashtus, after the Gemara was written and sealed, that you can't start your day with Baruch She'amar. You have to start before. You can't start with the bracha, Baruch She'amar. You have to start before. What did you say? It also grew. Matevu, Adenilam, Vahiyachad, Leilam. All of these things were added over time. Some of them were added earlier, and some of them were added later. But over time, a fourth ring was added to the concentric rings. A lower rung was added to the ladder. Okay, and I guess if you wanted to explain it in practical terms, you would say, since Jewish people are on a lower level, they have to climb one more step. Not have to climb one more step to get higher, have to climb one more step to get to the place where you used to start 2,000 years ago. They used to start with Baruch She'amar, and we start today with Adeni Mekabel, with Matev, with Adeni Elom, with Vayachad, Leilam Yeyadav. You understand? And that's the story of our Siddur. That's the story of our Siddur. The story of our Siddur is not a bunch of old rabbis who are bored, trying to be as mean as possible and keep us in shul as long as they can, because they know at least when we're in shul, we're not getting into trouble. It's people giving us the tools to climb and get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the more distant we are from Hashem, the more necessary rungs there are in the sulam, in the ladder of climbing and approaching Elokus. And this is what's going on. This is what's transpiring when we daven every single morning. So now, let's talk. Let's talk. Over the years, I have given, right, these are four worlds, right? There's not three worlds, there's four worlds. It used to be three. In the times of the Shas, it was three separate things. Shmanesah was one thing. Shema and its brachas was a second thing. Sukkot Zim and its brachas was a third thing. And sometimes someone did have to couple them. It probably already existed in the times of the Shas. It may even have existed in the times of the second base of Mikdash. But when the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which is over 2,500 years ago, introduced these takonis, they were separate takonis. One takonis say Shmanesah, another takonis say Birchas Krishma and Krishma, and then some rabbi said, let's be Soymich Geula L'Tefilah. Let's wrap Krishma around Shmanesah, let's join him. And then at a later date, it was decided to wrap Sukkot Zimmer, the brachas before and after, around Birchas Krishma and Shmeineh Esrei. And then at a much later date, they added a fourth wrap, another layer. And this later layer was probably added after the times of the Shas, either in the times of the Go'onim or in the times of the Mukubal. In other words, either like 1,200 years ago, 1,100 years ago, or much more recently, 800 years ago, or even 500 years ago. During the onset of the Golden Age of Kabbalah, they added another ring to davening. And these rings are a gradual climb from a lower level to a higher level, from a lower world to a higher world, beginning with Asiya, then Yitzira, then Bria, then Atzilus. Right? So now let's talk. How do you explain Asiya, Yitzira, Bria, Atzilus in plain English? What does it mean? What does it mean in plain English? Asiya means action, Yitzira means formation, Bria means creation, Atzilus means emanation. I'm as informed now that I translate them into English as I was before. I don't know anything. Or as they say in Brooklyn, I don't know nothing. What do they mean? So there's an answer. It's not a complicated answer. You can even find it in the Tanya if you know how to look. Asiya is the world of submission, acquiescence. I accept, I submit, and I acknowledge. This is true. Yetzira is the world of nature and personality. God made me a certain way. God made you differently, made her differently, and you differently. Right? There's five people, there's five souls. Each one has different personality. Yetzira means serving Hashem with my nature, with my personality. If my nature is to be more emotional, I'm more emotional. My nature is to be less emotional, I'm less emotional. If my nature is to be more positive, then I'm more positive. My nature is to be more afraid, then I'm more afraid. Everybody uses their personality and nature to serve Hashem. That's the world of Yetzira. Okay, the Hebrew word is teva. Asiya's Hebrew word is hoida'ah, to submit. Yetzira's Hebrew word is teva, nature. Bria, the Hebrew word for bria is sechel, shin chaf lamed, intelligence. Hashem gave us a brain. Our brain can understand things that are outside of the parameters of our personality, right? I'm able to intellectually know things that I can't personally relate to. To me, they're boring, but I'm smart enough to understand them. Chassidus takes to another level. Bria says, not only am I smart enough to understand them, I'm deep enough to understand things that should go against my nature and force myself to feel them. I can use my brain. I can use my brain that my heart should also get excited about the kinds of things that are against my nature. That's the world of Bria. So the Hebrew word for El Mabria is Sech. And then comes Atzilus. Atzilus is the world of divine inspiration. Atzilus is the world of Merkava, chariot. Atzilus is the world where God rests. Some of us, not all of us by any means, some of us, a very small select group of us, have experienced Ein Sof, godliness. You prepare yourself, you qualify yourself, you halify yourself, you purify yourself, and if you say the Shekhinah rests upon you, that's Atzilus. Okay, so the serving Hashem according to my personality, Seichel, serving Hashem according to my creativity, and then we're going to call ourselves Merkava, Mem Reish Chav Beis Hey. being a chariot for Elkus to rest upon you. Now, most people I know, let me restate that. Some of the people I know daven every day, and they don't actually journey through these four worlds. They just say a bunch of words. And I accept that. I understand that. In other words, I'm not only blaming them. It's a fact. It's so simple. But the mystical design, with the Gdei Yisrael of yesteryear, going back to all the way back to Tefilah, who introduced the beginnings of these processes. 90 brachas of Shmini Esrei, the brachas around Krishma, Psukkah de Zimmer, and the brachas around that. And then much later on, when they added the fourth rung to this ladder, and when they joined all these ladders together, they were doing this because there is a very, very precise and meaningful design to all of this, and they expected people to climb the ladder. That's what they call a makubal, a real Kabbalist who davens a little bit slower than us, even though he knows Hebrew quite well, climbs the ladder from Asiya to Yitzira, from Abriya to Atzilis. That's what he does. And then he climbs back down. And he climbs back down, he takes with him from his journey inspiration, which is going to continue in his Torah, which is going to do after his davening, and then in his parnasa, his pashat, making a livelihood, which is going to do after he finishes studying Torah, and your whole life becomes coupled together. We don't do many different things. We're on a track, step, 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 step. This was the vision of the Gedolei Yisrael who developed all of these ideas. This is how it's explained in Hasidus. Okay? Now, questions or comments?
No question.
At your own risk.
Just like for me, like it bothers me because like I feel like we are in a lower level to say.
Okay.
And the rabbis added all these things, and I feel like we nowadays have like so much less kavana, and sometimes we are like just like sick of davening or whatever. So,
You know, somebody once asked the Rebbe, what's his favorite prayer? Now, he didn't tell me why, but take a wild guess, because he's our Rebbe. So we got to say all the words. We have to show up for some of them. And if it's Maidani, let it be Maidani. You understand?
yeah.
So you're right. Point well taken. We daven less chavona. We daven more quickly. We're bored by davening, which is for one part of the davening, to the part of the davening which I relate to, which I talks to me, and through it I can connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I have to show up with that part. Now, realistically, to show up for one part, you really have to pay attention to all of it. But l'chol hapach, it's your piece of davening. You have to focus. So if one person is Meidani, for another person is Shema Yisrael, for another person it's Ala Tzadikim, for another person it's Ava Selam. But your piece of davening, you gotta show up. Fair enough. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? So let me put it to you straight. We're near the end of the first rung. We started Siddur classes probably 8 years ago. It's been a while. We've been learning Siddur for a long time. When I reduced my schedule, I used to teach here every day. I used to teach here 5 days a week. When I reduced my teaching schedule to 1 day a week, so we started with Siddur and Sichas. And of course, then it became Siddur or Sichas. Now it became a month or two of Siddur, a month or two of Sichas. Okay. I started teaching Siddur for Maidani. I started Maidani. And on my website, insidachsiddur.org, if you go to my Siddur section, all of the classes I gave here all of these years are there. And we didn't learn everything. We skipped a few pieces, or we skipped parts of pieces. I had this need not to finish. I should prove to myself that I'm not OCD. Sometimes we would start something, and when the school year would end, I wouldn't continue the next year in the middle. I would start something new. So we learned Maidani, we learned Atal Shadoye, we learned Ashatan on the kind of Shama, we learned the 15 brachas in the morning, Birchas HaTeira, Hariri Makabel, Matayvu, Adei Nelam, Vahiyachar, and the before and the after, the Loyal Meyada, Haramas Adesh, and Carbon Tower in the before and the after, Ketaitas the before and the after. We learned everything, we went in order. And last time we learned Siddur, we finished Haidu. So we're holding by Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. Now your page, it says page 29. You see at the top of a page, right? This is not the whole page, it's only a half a page. This is the newer Siddurim, where the pages are, the Siddur is laid out nicer, and the English and Hebrew are opposite each other. This is where we're holding. Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. Okay? Now, does anybody not know where this is? If you're not sure where this is in davening, please get a sit and look inside. I want you to see it. If you're not sure where this is, please get a sit and look inside. It's a couple of paragraphs before Baruch She'amar. Baruch She'amar. You recognize that, yeah? It's not right before Baruch She'amar, because between where we're holding and Baruch She'amar, you're going to have Hashem Melech, Hashem Melech, Hashem Yimlech, Hoshienu, and Ontzech Ben Guinness. You're going to have several things which we say in between. But we're almost by, when we get to Baruch She'amar, we've turned the page. Now we're switching from what's called Heida'ah, from the lowest world, which we also call Asiyah, to the world of Teva. Serving Hashem with your personality, with your nature, with your emotions, and so on. We're learning Mizmor Shir Chanukas. So I want to take a couple of things. First of all, who was the first person to incorporate Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis into the davening? Probably the Arizal. Probably, I think that Amak also mentions it, but not earlier. In other words, I saw in a siddur I was looking at this morning that he says we're only saying it for the last 300 years. I think that's a mistake. It's probably been said for 400 years or closer to 500 years. I mean, the Arizal passed away in Shin Lamed Gimel. So we're almost 450 years since the Arizal passed. And Arizal says to say Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. Then as far as I'm concerned, I think also that Amak, but I'm not sure about that. So it's been around. Not that long. The Rambam doesn't have it in his siddur. Rashi didn't have it in his siddur. Rabbi Amyam gone, the Psati gone, the Merekech, they didn't have it in their siddur. The Abu Draham doesn't have it in his siddur. But 700 years ago. But from the stage of the onset of the Kabbalah, most Jews say Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. But I have in my computer a list of different communities. The Yemenites don't say it every day. They say it Shabbos and Yom Tov. There's the Italians have their season. Everybody has their own times. When they say it. And there's a variety of different opinions. There's a variety of different opinions as to when it should be said. But most Jews say it every single day.
So when did we start having it here?
Okay, can I answer you in a few minutes? Do you mind? Okay. Ashkenazic Jews say it every day. Hasidic Jews say it every day. Mainstream Sfardim say it every day. Who doesn't? The Italians have a unique nusach, and the Yemenites have a unique nusach, and could be one or two other groups. So not in every siddur was Mizmor Shir Chanukas incorporated to be said every day, but in most it is. Chassidim say it, Misnagdim say it, and mainstream Sfardim, Eduta Mizrach, the standard Sfardish siddur, which I guess you could say is Iraq, Iraq, but it's not just Iraq, it's Iran also, which is Persia, and then of course there's Egypt and Syria, Morocco. They all have a similar siddur. The different Siddurim is the Yemenites, the Taman, Yadas Taman is a very different Siddur, and the Italians have a different Siddur, and they don't necessarily say every day. By the way, the Vilna Gaon, the great Gaon of Vilna, didn't say Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. If you look at Ashkenaz Siddurim that follow the Vilna Gaon, you don't have Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. But today, as far as I know, Ashkenaz Jews, that means Misnagdim, as we call them for lack of words, non-Hasidic European Jews, say Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. So I would say that it's safe to say two things. Statement number one, 500 years ago, nobody said it. Statement number two, today, almost all Jews who daven Shachris do say it. Okay, those are the two basic statements. But the question is when, right? Location, right? Davening is like real estate. It depends on where you're located. Okay, so here's the rule of thumb. Now, I owe you an answer to a question. I'm going to save it for the end of the first session. In other words, before we break for our regular break, I'll return to your question, but I want to stay on track for a moment. One thing is quite clear. You don't say Mizmor Shir Chanukas after Baruch She'amar. I don't think anybody does. Ashkenazim don't, Chassidim don't, and I don't think Sfardim do either. Mizmor Shir Chanukas is the beginning of the Siddur, but it's before Baruch She'amar. Why? Take a wild guess. Why is it before Baruch She'amar? Baruch She'amar is a bracha, right? What happens when you say brachas? No. You can't talk. From Baruch She'amar till Yishtabach, he can't speak. Why? Baruch She'amar is a bracha, Yishtabach is a bracha, everything in between is connected. And if you talk, you're making a hefsek. Now, When they decided to wrap Psukei Dezimmer around Birchas Krishma, you're not allowed to talk between the end of Yishtabach and the beginning of Yetzereir. Because once the Chas Chomim decided that they're going to join the second ring of the ladder with the third ring of the ladder, not only are you not allowed to talk between Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach, you're not allowed to talk between Yishtabach and Yetzereir. Now, you're not allowed to talk between the beginning of the Barachas Hashma till Gal Yisrael, because they're also an nu. They're one continuum, right? And then, of course, we add what the Chazal say. The Zohar says that Smichas Geula L'Tefilah, we join Gal Yisrael with Shbenesre. So from the moment you say Baruch Shem, you can't talk. So you don't say, hello, how are you, how's business, what's going on, who won the ball game, are you going on vacation this weekend? You don't ask those questions, you don't interrupt. And you don't even say words of Torah unless they're prescribed. You can't even, from the moment you say Baruch Shama, till after you finish Manasseh, you're not allowed to put in your own prayers. You need to have authority. You understand? So most Kehilas Kaddish be Yisrael. A, they say Mizmor Shir Chanukas. And B, they say it before the bracha of Baruch Shama. Why? Since this is such a late takona, since this is a relatively speaking recent addition to the Siddur, they didn't want to include it in that part of the davening that's under the banner of Nunu. Because once you say a bracha, and you're linking the bracha at the beginning with the bracha at the end, and then of course you're connecting the Yishtabach to the Yetzereir and all the rest, you don't want to be mafsik, you can't interrupt. So not only are you not allowed to speak divrei choil, not only are you not allowed to speak ordinary weekday prasta things, you can't even speak divrei kodesh that was not authorized. So it was decided by the Arizal and some other gedolim that we should say Mizmor Shir Chanukas, but it was also decided that they should say it in that part of the davening where you don't have to say, no, you can actually talk. So since you're allowed to say divrei choil, you can add extra divrei kodesh. If you're allowed to say ordinary things, you can certainly add an extra kapitel tilim, and that's Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis. And you'll see later this year, I'm hoping that when they added Hashem Melech, Hashem Melech, Hashem Yimlech, and Hashem and Ozech Ben Yiris, it was the same thing. Those are psukim, or paraphrases of psukim, kapitel tilim. Why are we adding these things? Because as long as you haven't said Baruch Shama, you can add anything you want. You can have a conversation with your friend. So they added these additional passages, the additional prayers before the Shemoneh Esrei. You understand? So now here comes the next step. I once davened in Ashkenaz Shul. A whole year davened in Ashkenaz Shul. And like anybody else, they're proud. They don't like when people come into their communities and change the news. So it was an invasion. A bunch of Lubavitcher boys entered into an Ashkenaz Shul. We were like eight, we were the majority of the minyan, but it was an Ashkenaz Shul and we would get daven Ashkenaz. So the rabbi, who was then an old man, would come into shul. The boys had gotten up earlier. They went to the mikveh, they learned chassidus, they were ready for davening, and the rabbi would come in. Mizmor Shir Chanukas, this is how we came into the shul. Okay, let's go. Mizmor Shir Chanukas. He wanted to make sure we say hoidu, right? We say Rabbi Shmuel Omer b'shleish esrei midos Yosef Anach Hashem Elokeinu v'kaviseinu shibana beis hamikdash. We say Kaddish D'Rabbanan, and we said hoidu. This rabbi Fruchters used to go to the Yom and say Birchas Shachar. In other communities outside Chabad, the Chazan goes to the Yom before Hoidu and says Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. Says Baruch Atah Hashem, and the whole community says Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. Hanei saying Lasech Vivin Lahafke B'Yerim. Anyone says Amen. Baruch Atah Hashem. And we say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. Shalei Asani Goy, Shalei Asani Yovish, Shalei Asani Ish, and so on. There are many communities of Jews, I think Ashkenaz Jews also, that say Birchas Hashachar. But then you say a Kaddish after Rabbi Shmuel, and you don't say a Kaddish. And he would always say, Mizmor Shir Chanukas, like, don't think about saying Hoidu. When the Ashkenazim Jews say Hoidu? After Baruch Shama. So the davening in an Ashkenaz minyan would start with Mizmor Shir. I remember this very distinctly. He would say Kaddish, Mizmor Shir Chanukas, and Baruch Shama. By the way, they don't say Hoshienu and Ozech Ben Yiris either. And after Baruch Shama, you hear him say Hoidu Hashem Kirei V'Shmai. And then they would say Mizmor L'Seidah. So Hoidu was an older prayer than Mizmor Shir. It's been around longer. I don't know how much longer, but it's been around longer. And more importantly, it was said in the Beis HaMikdash, right? We discussed this earlier this year. The first part was said in the morning. The second part was said in the afternoon. The third part was said after the Churban Habayis. But Hoidu, David HaMelech said it in the Beis HaMikdash. David HaMelech arranged for it to be said in the Beis HaMikdash each day. So it's an older takana. So you this Ashkenaz included in Psukkah de Zimra. You the Shvat and Hasidim, of course, go after the meaning of Shvat, put it before Shemini Esrei for mystical reasons, not for halachic reasons. And then there's Mizmor Shir Chanukas. So to put in plain words, if we were misnagdim, we'd have this Ashkenaz, our davening would start Mizmor Shir Chanukas, then we would say Baruch She'amar, and then we would say Haidu. Of course, we're like the Sfardim, Chassidim. We say Haidu, then Mizmor Shir Chanukas, then we add a couple more additional prayers, Hashem Melech, Hashem Melech, Hashem Melech, and then Baruch She'amar, and then comes Mizmor L'Seid. So the location of Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis LaDavid, and now I'm going to say a word in Kabbalistite, don't get nervous, okay? Everybody agrees that Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis LaDavid is the end of Asiyah. If they added after the Churban Habayis, after the end of the Siyam Hashas, whenever it was, whether the times of the Rishonim, or the times of the Mekubalim, or the times of the Bali HaMinhagim, the fourth rung, that you don't start davening Baruch She'amar, you start davening with saying earlier things, whatever it is, La'olam Yehiyadam, Darten Zeis Teira Sa'ela, Darten Savas B'nei Yisrael, Chobin Elachli Ishai, there's different things that have been said with times in the Goyim already, the Amram gone and so on. This fourth ladder, the outside ring, the first piece is the world of Asiyah. Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis LaDavid is the end of Asiyah. After Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis LaDavid, you're ready to ascend from Asiyah into Yetzirah, which is the first bracha of Psukkah de Zimra. Baruch Shamar V'Hayayla. Did we understand? Yeah, for better or for worse. I mean, this is a long conversation, but this is the Nukud. So Mizmor Shir Chanukas is said by Sfardim and Ashkenazim, by Chassidim, and Misnagdim. Again, there are communities that don't say it, but they are, in terms of numbers, in the minority. I mean, you can never say about the Yiddishkeit minority, but still, in percentages of people, they're a small group. Most Yidden say Mizmor Shir Chanukas every day, and all those who say it, as far as I know, say it before Baruch She'amar. And they say it for Baruch She'amar because you can't come along and add a prayer and put it into the section of davening, which we have called nu. If you can't talk, you can't say extra psukim. Okay? Now, the last question that I'm going to answer is going to be yours. So if anybody has other questions or comments, ask them now. Then you'll ask your question. Then we'll break, and then we'll have a second class on this subject. Go ahead.
Like, what's so special about Mizmor David and Mizmor
Shir Chanukas.
Right.
Well, it's going to take us 4 or 5 weeks to figure that out.
Like, why did the
Why this one?
This one specifically.
Right. Okay, so stick around for the second class. I have 7 reasons, and I assure you that there's more than 7. There's reasons why this particular capital was picked, and I want you to know, I've spent a lot of time preparing this. The last 2 months, when we were learning Sichos every week, I would spend my Wednesday mornings doing this. It's a very confusing capital because it's a siso. There's incredibly happy psukim in this capital, and there's bitter psukim in the same capital. This capital is mamish a yo-yo. It's back and forth. So it confuses you as to what it means, let alone why it's here. But there's a bunch of reasons why it was incorporated into the Siddur. That's going to be our next conversation. Anybody else? I'll get you in a second. I don't mean to be a pain. Okay, go ahead.
So you said Mizmor Shir Chanukas Habayis is the last section of the last.
Before Baruch She'amar. Understand that if you look at an Ashkenaz Siddur, non-Chabad Siddur, they don't say Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach. They don't say Heshienu. They say the Mizmor Shir Chanukas is Rabbi Baruch She'amar. Right, because that's another beard. You understand? There's another board and base. It's another layer. It's another dimension. Okay? Any other questions or comments? So what was your original question that I told you I would answer at the end?
Like, when did we start using?
So the first thing you have to remember is the printing press is not much more than 500 years old, right? There's a cutoff point, the year 1500. Between 1500 and 2000 is 521 years, right? The printing press is more than 1500. It goes back to the 1400s. For example, Reish Nun Beis, 5252 is 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain. The earliest go back as far as Reish Samach. Reish Samach is 1500. There are Siddurim that go back even earlier. But before the printing press, the whole life of people was very, very different. People had to know things by heart, much more. And if you had a siddur, it was hand copied. Hand copied. That's number one. Then there's a number two that did not allow you to write anything down but the Tanakh. Save us advarim ha'ela kapi advarim ha'ela. Dvarim ha'ela terashe lekasan. The Gemara says it's a halacha that you're not allowed to write down Teresh Balpeh. You're not allowed to write down the oral Torah. And Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, when he wrote the Mishnah, was doing an Aveda. He was violating an explicit pasuk in the Torah that you're not allowed to write it down. He wrote it down anyway because of the principle of Eis Lasses La Hashem Fedu Torah Secha. Had Rabbeinu HaKadosh not written down the Mishnah, we would not be Jews. And even if we would be Jews, we wouldn't know how to practice Judaism. So he violated the law against writing things down to preserve what we have. You understand? Now, I want to whisper this in the ear, but if you're sensitive, don't take it, don't listen to it, and don't repeat it to anybody else. There's another great advantage of the fact that Torah was not written down. The Bible belongs to the whole world. The Talmud is only ours. The only reason the Talmud is uniquely Jewish and the Bible is everybody's is because it was written at such late a date that it lost interest in us. You understand? The miracle of the lack of record of Torah Sheba'al Peh is, like it says in the davening of Shabbos, there's parts of Judaism which only Jews have. And one of the significant reasons for this is because the Torah Sheba'al Peh was written down till a much later date. Hashem did not want the whole world to be Jewish. He wanted the Jewish people to be Jewish. Not that all other human beings, chas v'shalom, don't matter. They have a different purpose, to be human beings, not to be Jews. And one of the reasons that this separation was sustained, was because the Torah was oral. And if you didn't have the tradition, you were lost. Included in this ban was the prohibition against writing down the siddur. So the siddur was oral. The siddur was by heart, which explains to you this whole phenomenon of Chazaras Hashatz. The Chazan repeats the Shmoneh Shachas and Mincha, might have not. And nobody knows why. There's a simple reason why. If you go back far enough in history, davening was done Baal Peh. You were not allowed, today you daven by heart, you consider the Shvat. You were not allowed to write it down. So you have to know the siddur by heart. The average person didn't. So he went to shul, or she went to shul, sat down on a bench, and the guy got up and he said, Hashem tiftach v'yagita Baruch atah Hashem, and everybody said Baruch Hashem, Amen. And they were yetze davening by answering Amen. God will yetze Amen yetze. They didn't know how to daven. So when you ask me when was the siddur written, that's a very subjective question. I can give you 3 different answers, and they would all be with some integrity. Answer number 1: when the siddur was designed. The siddur was designed by the Anshe Kesed Gadol, the members of the Great Assembly. They lived at the end of the Golos Bavel, the end of the Babylonian exile, going into the beginning of the Second Temple. That's 2,500 years ago, approximately 2,500 years, a long time ago. And many of the members of this Great Assembly were actual prophets, Nevi'im. And they used their Ruach HaKodesh, the divine inspiration, to design structure for the Jewish people. One of the basic things that they designed was the siddur. But the siddur they have was considerably different. They didn't have Tfilas Hashem, you understand? They didn't have, they had Shmoneh Esrei, that's it. Then in a different page, in a different book, they had Brachas Krishma. And a different page, in a different book, they had Psukei D'Zimra, Brachas of Psukei D'Zimra. And later, after them, and again, it's hard to know how much later, but at a later date, still, these things were coupled. Now, when was the first siddur written? When did actually take a pen and a paper and write it down? So unless you were a Ganef, unless you were a Megillah Storimnik, the first siddurim were written down probably 600 or 700 years after the siddur was originally designed. So if you're going to say that the birth of the siddur is 2,500 years, you can say the text of siddur, the written version of the siddur, is probably 1,800 years old, maybe even younger, 1,500 years old when they finished the Mishnah, the Gemara. The Mishnah is around 1,800 years old, the Gemara is 1,500 years old. Over that period, between the time that the Anshe Kesed Gadol introduced the siddur and that it was written down, 2 things happened. Number 1, they added more, including the additions of coupling, of joining together Shmoneh Esrei with Gal Yisrael, and then Psukei D'Zimra with Brachas Krishma and so forth. And they also had tons of new mistakes. How could you not have mistakes if you're giving it over Baal Peh for 600 years from ear to mouth? Taimane, Yemenites can give things over mistake proof, but that's it. Not all the Jews were Yemenites. Some of them came from Tefilah and from Tzipoidi and from Tzfas and from Yerushalayim and from Hebron and from Nahado and Pompadisa and Surya and other places like that. Surah. You understand? So now, when the Siddur was finally written, so they wrote the Siddur with the additions, and then they had to make the corrections. And then there was the division. Jews were separated. You had Jews in Yemen, you had Jews in Asia Minor, you had Jews in Europe, you had Jews in Western Europe, and then eventually Jews in Eastern Europe, Jews in Italy. And the Siddurim began to radiate. They became various. The original Siddur was finally written down, and it was written down with the additions, and then they kept adding more additions, and then they were again doing mistakes that were corrected, and people corrected the mistakes in different ways. They became different nuschos over time. You understand? Until the printing press, which is another 1,000 years later. When the pre-printing press is introduced, so now there's a Maila and a Chasana. The Maila is, if everybody has the same book, there's no mistakes. But on the other hand, if there's a mistake, it's for posterity, because it's a printed mistake. Printed mistakes, aladoiris. So you had a whole new layer of troubles. How do you fix the Alter Rebbe made a Siddur himself, and the Alter Rebbe Siddur is very, very unique because it's really one of the few Siddur that we know the name of the author. The Chassidim have a nusach. Chassidim, non-Chabad Chassidim have a nusach. We don't know who did it. It was one of the Media Baal Shem. They made a nusach at Tefilah, which is the Chassidish nusach. Most Chassidim come from the nusach, with the exception of Chabad and maybe Breslov and a few others. But the Alter Rebbe Siddur, we know exactly who made it. He made the Siddur himself. Understand? And he, nevertheless, the first print of the Alter Rebbe Siddur, which was printed during his lifetime, is filled with mistakes. And those mistakes have to be corrected. In the second print and the third, with the printing has a big maile, a big upside, and a big chasara. I read recently, I'm not an expert on books at all. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm an expert on looking like I'm an expert, which is again expertise. But they found in Russia, the library of the Rebbe Rashab. You know about that, right? There's a library, the Rebbe's library, the Tefilah Kabbalah, which are joined together here in Beis Chayenu in 770, Beis Agudas Tzidich Chabad, Beis Rabbeinu Shababovo. But there's a huge library of Sfarim that belong to the Rebbe Rashab, which is still in Moscow. It's in the museum, which is connected to the Chabad house in Moscow. In that collection, they found a copy of the first print of Siddur Al-Qaddas. There was a presumption that it's lost. There's not a single copy extant. They found a copy. The first few pages are missing because the Siddur was used, but they have it in that library. And apparently, the Alter Rebbe, during his lifetime, printed the Siddur and then wrote corrections. Alter Rebbe himself wrote corrections because when they typed it, they made mistakes in the typing. And that they make a second edition and a third edition. You understand? So you asked a question that should have been a simple up and down, straight black and white answer, but you got a very complicated answer. If I had to repeat my answer, I would say there's three answers to your question. Number one, when the Anshe Knesset Sagadela formulated the Tefilah, that's 2,500 years ago. Number two, when people permitted themselves to put pen to paper and write the Siddur down, which is probably the same time that the Mishnah was written, which is about 1,800 years ago. Number three, from the time the printing press was introduced, which is about 600 years ago. And in each one of these steps, there's so many sub-steps, you have no idea. Okay? So we're going to break. Yeah, let's reconvene in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If I seem enthusiastic, it's because I am. It's nice to get back to the Siddur. It's been so long. I'm turning this guy, this girl.